So grief is an area that many people struggle with, but everybody is required to encounter. And I am not exempt from this in any stretch. I have lost people who I care for dearly, whether it be clients that I was responsible for, or whether it was family or friends who were near to my heart. Grief is not something that any person escapes. And in fact, it is something that we experience in varying capacities and levels depending on our season in life. And so at times you might find there was a grief that you experienced letting go of specific sins. It could have been through vices that had provided comfort for a long time, or even people who no longer served you and where you were going in the future. Grief might be something that you have experienced as you've grown in the faith, letting go of the direction you want to lead your life and letting the Lord lead you and grieving that. Maybe at times you have felt grief about having to do specific things to honor the Lord and not necessarily feeling that you were immediately vindicated in the situation, right? Like there's a grief that comes even from just letting go of what my ego wants to do, what I feel like should be fair in this moment. Maybe you went through times of suffering and loss where people left your life and you didn't know what to make of them leaving. Maybe you went through changes in your life, leaving jobs that were really important to you, or having to let go of activities because you could no longer do them, maybe for health or physical injury. There are so many ways in which we experience loss, both as a person and as a believer, and times where we have to deal and rectify with what do I do with this crushing and profound feeling of loss that seems to overshadow every moment of my day. How do I cope with that? How do I deal with that? Scripture is a place of comfort, but I also want you to know I mutually have been in the same place. And truthfully, I would have never chosen to be a person who would converse about grief and loss. In fact, when I was in the middle of school doing my master's, I was dead center in COVID. And I had a professor look me in the eye and she said, please take care of yourself, because she could see the profound and deep loss that I was dealing with in that time, trying to go through school. And I was just trying to get by. I was trying to push aside the fact that I had just lost a family member that was very dear to me. I was getting emails about people who passed on a fairly regular basis for varying reasons. And nothing really prepares you for that moment where you open that message and you find out another person is gone for this reason. And then to go back out there that same day and act like nothing impacted you and to continue doing what you're doing. Nothing prepared me for that. And when I was in the middle of this and I was feeling that crushing feeling like I was barely able to move to the next day, I finally had to sit down and take a break. And by the grace of God, He gave me a class about grief. I never would have anticipated being in the middle of the death of a family member and having to discuss grief and loss for the next few months in a class. And yet, it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me because it gave me a language that I didn't even know I needed. And to date, this has now been a number of years past, like I would say 4 years now. And I am consistently encountering clients, people, friends who are dealing with grief and loss. And I will say that having the language to be able to process through the experience has been so integral. And it's something that I love sharing with other people because it started to help and make sense for many people. And I sat with people who went through losses of children. It could be things that were health related, or it could be something much more tragic. I've sat with people who've lost family members like parents or uncles or cousins or siblings. and had to look them in the eye and just be with them in that moment. And so that very painful lesson that I went through is something I'm hoping to bring into this particular teaching, to say grief and loss affects us all. And it doesn't matter how trained you are. It doesn't matter how educated you are. It doesn't matter how smart or strong, competent, capable. I've heard it all. People who look me in the eye and say, I should be able to just move past this, right? And the fact is, there is nothing that prepares you with having to rectify that you've lost something that was so dear, and there is no way to get it back. And so what does the Lord tell us? He doesn't tell us that life will be easy or we won't go through loss. In fact, he gives us words of encouragement to know that, for example, in Psalm 34, verse 18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. In Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Jesus is described as a man of many sorrows. Jesus is deeply embedded in grief and loss, much like our day-to-day experience can be. He knew the difficulty and hardship that came from living on this earth. And if you are a Christian, you're going to go through moments like that. And I know sometimes it seems easy to think, well, I have a relationship with God, so shouldn't these things be easier? In some ways, yes, because the comfort that the Lord provides is, there's nothing comparable. There is nothing like having his presence in a moment where you feel like you're going to be crushed by pain, and he is the only voice you can hear. He will help offset that pain that you would have to deal with on your own. But make no mistake, as a believer, we are still going to go through times of hardship and grief. And how do we process that loss? There was a particular model in my class that made the biggest difference to me. And it was learning that there's a dual model of grief that people go through. So this dual process model of grief operates a bit like a pendulum. So the more time that we spend in a place of grief, we eventually move into a place of restoration, a place of hope, right? But it swings back and forth. And how you know you are processing and moving through grief, like setting aside the 5 different stages of grief, I would really encourage you to look at the Kübler-Ross model of grief, because that's really helpful to know if you want to understand the 5 stages of grief. But if you also want to look at this dual process model of grief, it's a pendulum and you swing back and forth. The more time you go through the process, you spend less time in the grief stage, you spend more time in the recovery, restorative stage. And so it truthfully just swings back and forth, right? Right. And that's why you'll notice that people can seem okay for a minute and then suddenly be hit with this wave of grief and sorrow that overwhelms them. So they're just moving back and forth between that. Right. And the point is to help the person move to a place of like, how do I relate to this thing now? How do I relate to this person now that they're gone? The relationship has to change. Right. We have to be able to look forward to things in the future. There has to be opportunities, though, for us to continue at times as needed to mourn. And I don't care which person I encountered. I don't care if they were very spiritually mature and developed. At the end of the day, we are all flesh. We are all made of dirt. We all come from the ground, and we're going to go back one day on a flesh basis, right? We all ultimately are frail, and we need God. We need his strength. We need his power to endure these things, to be able to move through situations that we think at times are going to crush us. And grief, like I mentioned, is not just about losing a person. It's not just about death. It could be the end of a relationship, something we never anticipated coming. Maybe it was deeply entrenched in very severe betrayal. You trusted this person and they broke your heart in a way you didn't even know you could feel. You didn't even know you could hurt like that. And now you look at other situations and you think, I could never trust this again. Maybe it has to do with just even the idea of getting another job after the other one treated you so poorly that you put 17 years of hard work and effort, blood, sweat, and tears, and only to find that they let you go at the slightest inconvenience to them. Maybe it has to do with the way you relate to your children or your spouse. Maybe something happened in that relationship that changed the way that you looked at them. You no longer look at them in the same light. That relationship has effectively died. And now it has to take a new form. What do I do with that? Maybe it has to do with the way you think about yourself. Maybe something has changed the way you see yourself, and there's a grief and a loss that comes from that. I don't know what your circumstance is. I don't know what your situation is, but grief impacts us all. And learning to find the language for it is really important. And there are a lot of environments that will do human emotion a genuine disservice because they try to oversimplify the response. This is why I find it so concerning when I see people who are not equipped to have these conversations doing it in a very public way. Because what do is they oversimplify something that is far more complex than how they're communicating it. And the problem is this oversimplification of something they don't really understand hurts people in the process, because then they assume, if only I knew this, if only I could do it like that, failing to understand they are not exempt from it. And the teaching was overly simplified to begin with. Dealing with loss and grief is not just picking up your bootstraps and moving on. Sometimes it is walking through a season of grief and pain and not running from it, not trying to avoid it, not trying to escape from it. In fact, I will say this is one of the most reoccurring themes I see when people come to a point of like breaking down, is that when I trace with them what happened, how did we get to this point, you will see that there were particular points where they needed to stop, to process, to feel, and to grieve, and they ignored it. And they just kept going until it just took a completely different form. Think for a minute about like a physical ailment, right? Let's say, for example, you have a cut. It could be small. It could be easy to treat. But because you ignore it, what happens? It becomes infected. And it can turn into a much greater infection. In fact, something like that could infiltrate your blood. It can turn septic. It could kill you if it's not properly treated. But it's something that started small. It's something that could have been remedied early, right? And so when talking about things like mental health or mental illness or things like loss, we often oversimplify and assume that it's just something that we just need to ignore and move on. But the problem becomes is that as we go on, as we continue trying to push forward, there is a point where we are forced to look face to face with what it is we're running from the pain, the grief, the loss, the betrayal. It doesn't matter. We have to sit with it. We have to feel it. That's actually part of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is not just recognizing how one feels. It's not just finding effective coping strategies, but it's also being able to tolerate it, to being able to be with it without pushing it away. I'm angry and I can be angry right now and not be angry at myself for being angry. I can be sad and not be angry with myself for feeling sad and trying to force myself to be happy, even though I'm sad. I can be with that. I can recognize it for what it is, and I know what to do with that. And quite frankly, there's a immaturity that comes from needing that feeling to just disappear immediately. Sometimes things take time. Sometimes you have to be patient with how you feel, and that's okay. This is why we're careful even from diagnosing grief. We don't do that. We give people time because grief that comes from loss is not necessarily pathological. It actually could be something that just takes time. Something like prolonged grief disorder, that takes time before you get a diagnosis out of that. That's not just a quick and immediate response. We don't diagnose people with depression when they just lost somebody. Why? Because they're grieving, and it's normal to grieve. It's okay to grieve. And maybe there's somebody here who thinks it's not okay for you to grieve. You just need to keep pushing things aside and keep moving forward, pretending everything's okay. And I'd like to tell you, it's okay to grieve. It doesn't make you less of a person. It doesn't make you bad at whatever you're responsible for. It makes you human.